record started. Thanks for attending today. This is EPM 5.8 Upgrade, session number 3. The topic of the day is ICD 10, major enhancement for all of us in version 5.8. I'm going to go ahead and share my desktop. And the first thing you should see is the training document you just downloaded open to the table of contents. Now, this is our only topic for the day. I do a bit of an overview on ICD 10. There's some tables and file maintenance involved with ICD 10, so we're going to touch the ICD Codes master file, the diagnosis code library, diagnosis subgrouping, payers, and diagnosis categories. And once we have all of our setup in place, we're going to go to EPM and talk about general user preferences. We're going to touch charge posting to see how ICD 10 works during charge posting. We have a new search functionality in particular that's very new and different for all of us in EPM. We're going to talk about how diagnosis code mappings affect claims in EPM. We'll look at a few changes in the way diagnosis codes display in the patient chart. We'll look at some claims with ICD 10 codes on them. We'll do changes to reports related to ICD 10 and also form and label templates. So I have our agenda for this afternoon. So let's go ahead and start with the overview. We're ICD 10 codes. They're just another revision of what we currently use. ICD 9 codes, they're the next revision. So ICD 9, that's revision 9. ICD 10 is revision 10. This 10 code set was actually developed by the World Health Organization many years ago. ICD 10 codes have already been implemented in many countries in the world. We, in our country here, have just not done that yet. Well, that's going to be changing come next year. ICD 10 code set is a much more granular and specific code set. And the intent behind these new codes is that they're going to increase clinical accuracy and allow for much better tracking and disease trending. Plus, we'll be using the same code set that other countries are in the world, so we can do worldwide comparisons as well. When are ICD 10 codes to be implemented? October 1st of next year. So here we are in July of 2013. We have about a year and 2 months to go before this all hits us and hits our clients. And the reason we are preparing clients so well in advance is because this is going to be quite a major undertaking for all. In my mind, as a trainer, I can only imagine what it's going to be like for end users in a practice that do the billing and the coding and the charge entry every day, particularly for users that maybe have been in those types of positions for many years. They have many ICD 9 codes memorized. They just fly through charge entry without even having to think about it. Well, when we get to the point of throwing an entirely new set of diagnosis codes on those users, it is going to be a challenge to those users initially until they get used to this new code set. How are ICD 10 codes different from ICD 9? Here's just a simple side-by-side comparison. We all know currently today ICD 9 codes are typically 5 numeric characters, such as 250.01 for a diabetes code. There are some ICD 9 codes that start with a letter, but by far the vast majority of ICD 9 codes are strictly 5 numbers, up 5 numbers I should say. With ICD 10, the codes are actually going to be 7 alphanumeric characters, so 2 additional characters. ICD 9s are strictly digits, with exceptions like I mentioned a moment ago. There are some that start with a letter, but majority, they're all digits 0 through 9. ICD 10 also uses digits 0 through 9, but also letters A through T and V through Z to come up with that 7-character code. This next one is probably the biggest eye-opener. Right now, ICD 9 codes, if you add up these 2 different volumes together, we come up with about 17,000 codes currently in use today with ICD-9. Well, next year, we're suddenly going to be using an average. I've heard lots of various numbers from different people, so I'm going to use an average number of maybe 75 or 80,000 codes. That's a huge difference. And I mentioned a minute ago that the ICD-10 codes are much more specific. That's why we have so many of them. That one code we might use today for diabetes might have 10 ICD-10 codes, each one, being a little more specific than the other. So there are many, many, many codes in this code set that end users are going to be working with and dealing with potentially. What I did on this next page is the training document. I just stumbled across this in NextGen's development spec for ICD-10, and I thought it was a great example, so I threw it into our training document here. It's a comparison of an ICD-9 code to its counterpart in ICD-10. It's for chronic gout. An ICD-9 code, there's our 5-digit code, 274.02. The first 3 digits indicate a category. The second 2 digits indicate a category, an anatomic site, and a severity. Well, that's a lot packed into 2 digits there at the end. If you compare it to a chronic gout ICD-10 code, we've got an alpha starts with a letter, and that holds true for almost all ICD-10 codes. They're going to start with a letter, so that M1A is still considered a category, but each digit beyond the decimal is another level of specificity. It's like with ICD-9, we all know that a 5-digit ICD-9 code is more specific than a 4-digit ICD-9 code. Well, it's the same concept with ICD-10. A 7-digit ICD-10 code is going to be more specific than a 6-digit or a 5-digit or a 4-digit or a 3-digit. So that 4-digit extension here in this ICD-10 example, the 3120, the 3 is really the etiology part of the code, indicating renal impairment. The 1 is an anatomic site, indicating shoulder. The 2 is a laterality, indicating the left shoulder. And the 0 is an extension, indicating gout without tophi. Tophi or tophi. I'm sorry, I'm saying it both ways for just in case purposes. Up to a 7-digit code. Now, when I get into setup and file maintenance, showing some examples in EPM later, some ICD-10 codes might just be that 3 characters at the beginning. A lot of codes are 3 characters. A lot of codes are 4 characters. A lot of codes are 5. A lot of codes are 6. A lot of codes are the full-blown 7. But I just thought, again, this was kind of a nice comparison, taking code an end user might be used to today and indicating what that code might look like come October 1st of next year when they're starting to have to use ICD-10. Other topics here, ICD-10 frequently asked questions. This I took directly out of the NextGen What's Next newsletter that came out last month in June and was sent to all of our clients. I haven't looked at the most recent newsletter, but I would imagine we're probably going to have the same information in newsletters from here forward. But this particular item in last month's newsletter is trying to make clients aware that if they have questions regarding ICD-10, we have a knowledge exchange article that's going to be used to capture frequently asked questions and answers. It's Knowledge Exchange Article 11710. If you were to go look at that article today, it's not real robust. There's not all that much in it today. But over time, between now and next October, as clients come in with more and more questions, if one of those questions is a good question that all clients should be aware of, we're going to add it to this knowledge exchange article. So over time, this article is going to be growing and growing and growing, and it's our first source or our first resource we want to point clients to. Maybe a question they have can already be answered in this article. If they go to the article and they don't see their question or it doesn't answer their question, they certainly could be routed through support for additional assistance. The page talks about an ICD-9, ICD-10 comparison utility. This is a utility developed by our group in Atlanta, NextGen in Atlanta. And a wonderful little tool. Mark Schlichting in Atlanta did a demo for trainers, maybe it's been a month or two ago at this point. And I've been there and I've played around a little bit with it, and it's a wonderful, wonderful tool. It's not only available for us internally, it's available for NextGen clients. And essentially what it allows clients to do once they're logged into the utility, they type in, for example, an ICD-9 code that they're used to using today to have the utility tell them what's the corresponding ICD-10 code going to be come next October. And keep in mind, ICD-9s are much more generic than 10s. So type in that ICD-9 code, it might come up with a listing of 10, 15, 20 different ICD-10 codes. Well, that's why it's important for clients to kind of, start thinking about this now. They're going to have to, come up with a process or whatever of determining, based on the codes we use today, what are the codes we're going to be using next year. And utility is wonderful for that. Again, they can type in a 9 code to find what a corresponding 10 code is. They go the opposite direction. They can type in a 10 code to a utility, tell them what a corresponding 9 code is. There's additional functionality in this utility. For example, it allows a client to browse out to find one of their existing electronic claim files, the full of ICD-9 codes. They pull that electronic claim file into this utility, have the utility automatically convert all the 9 codes to 10s. Of course, those are for testing purposes only. We're not by any means wanting or even suggesting that a client use the utility to create their production claim files. It's for testing only. But it's a great tool to take an existing file they just sent to Navicure 2 weeks ago, full of ICD-9 codes, pull into this utility and have the utility convert all those 9s to 10s. So they can kind of see what they're in for in the future, what kind of codes they're going to have to start looking at and considering using in the future. There's additional functionality in this utility, and if time permits, at the end of this session, I would like to log into this utility and show you the little bit I know about it. I'm by no means the expert. Corporate training doesn't train the utility. There's a group in Atlanta that offers regular sessions on it, but I do want to give you a bit of a demo so you have an idea of this tool that's available to clients between now and next October. Coming from the What's Next newsletter, everything you're seeing on this entire page and the next page is directly from the newsletter. Step 1 for clients to get access to this utility, if you're a current NextGen client and you're registered with our current client support center, you're able to get enrolled and signed up for this utility. If not a registered client, click on this link to register. After completing a registration and creating a user ID and password, NextGen just wants to confirm who you are and basically confirm access approval. Once you've been approved, all the client has to do is go log into it. And there is a phone number here for any login issues related to the utility. Next page, step 2, once you have a username and password and you're set up and ready to go with the utility, here's how to get to it. Links in the training document. Just click a link or go to your internet browser and go to this link. It'll do a login page. At login, I think you have to register the first time or something, if I recall. It's been a while since I did it. But basically, these are step-by-step instructions. And in the end, if you're having issues with access to the utility, then log a ticket to support with this subject. If it's not an access issue but a general issue with the utility, you can log a support ticket using this as the subject on the ticket. So it's an access issue or it's a use issue. I mentioned a few minutes ago that there is regularly scheduled training on the utility. It's available today. Though we're 14 months away from next October, NextGen is currently actively conducting training sessions on this utility. Again, we're just trying to make sure clients get a head start as far in advance on all of this as possible. If anyone is interested in receiving training, and be sure share this with clients or remind them of the June What's Next newsletter to go find this information. They can click on this link and search for a webinar by this name, get registered for it. This webinar will include training on how to use that utility. That's just a bit of an overview. We're getting ready to go into file maintenance. Something came into my head and it fell out just as quick. I apologize for that. Let's go ahead and get into file maintenance. Now we're going to touch the ICD master file, the diagnosis code library, enterprise preferences, diagnosis subgroupings, payers, and diagnosis categories in file maintenance. So we're going to start out in the ICD master file, and that's where I'm going to go ahead, minimize the training document, and let's go ahead and get into file maintenance. And I forgot to put that chat board up. I'm sorry. I promise to have that in front of me, so give me a second to get the chat board up. No one else has mentioned they cannot hear me, so let me ask participants. Everyone, would you mind going back to the participant panel just for a second? And if you can hear me okay, please turn on your green check mark. I have the green check marks, Marcy, so it seems everyone can hear me. And it must be something with your phone. And Allison, I see your question about the document. I'm sorry you missed it at the beginning. I'll post it at the end of the session for you. Okay, file maintenance. Let's go to our ICD master file. To be real careful while at the ICD master file, because if you can picture version 5.7 and prior, this table is currently called the ICD 9 Codes master file. They've renamed the table because it now in version 5.8 includes both ICD 9 codes and ICD 10 codes, so the name of the table itself is more generic, just simply ICD codes. I'm going to go ahead and go into the table, and it's just a slight change in here. It's not a big change, but it's an important change to be aware of. I'm on an ICD 9 code. Added in this table is an ICD type. Here in this section, I'm circling with my mouse. This is an ICD 9 code. So upon upgrade to, and that's what clients have in this table currently. Right now in their databases, it's full of nothing but ICD 9 codes. When they upgrade to version 5.8, the upgrade will automatically mark the ICD 9 button for every existing code in this table in their database. Okay. In contrast now, I'm going to look at an ICD 10 code. Starter, only 4 characters long. It's a didactic code, just like the last one I showed you. This one is flagged as ICD 10. So really, these 2 buttons, this is all that's new in 5.8 in this table. On upgrade, all codes will be flagged as ICD 9s. Now there's going to be an additional step for clients to get the 10s into their database, and that's where I'm going back to the training document for a second. After they upgrade to version 5.8, the original plan was this, and it changed over time. Technical reasons that I'm not able to fully explain. I'm not a technical person, but the original plan was to include ICD 10 codes in the 5.8 upgrade. So when you upgraded to 5.8, would blow in those 75 or 80,000 codes into your master file. Well, it turns out 75 or 80,000 codes is too much for the upgrade to handle. So will not be included in the upgrade. You would up your database first, like we've always done all along, and after the upgrade, They have to use the ICD CPT update utility to import a 2013 file of ICD-10 codes. Both the utility and ICD file are going to be included in the components folder on the upgrade. In other words, we're going to ship both of these things as part of the upgrade. They'll run the upgrade first, then run this utility to import the codes into their master file in file maintenance. So not an automatic upgrade. You've got the codes. You have to upgrade and then import the codes. On that. Okay, that takes us next to the diagnosis code library in file maintenance. We know whatever codes are in this ICD mass file. I sometimes in training call this the ICD book that's laying around in the billing office somewhere. It's just a big old book full of thousands of codes. It's got every code in it. End users aren't using this book, though. End users are using the diagnosis code library. So by default, and for new clients, we take the entire book, we put it into a diagnosis library. This is what's being used by end users in EHR and in EPM. It also includes all codes in the book. We just set up their system, we install the system that way. Here's the one table that's the book. We took all the codes in the book and we blew them into this library for you. So you're starting out with all codes in this library. Well, again, just on, should we just provide a utility now that imports 80,000 additional ICD-10 codes into every client's diagnosis library? Or should we let the clients decide which ICD-10 codes they'd like to add to their current diagnosis library? And the final answer is we're going to let clients decide. So we have an additional step, clients, and anyone upgrading to 5.8. After upgraded, after you've imported 8,000 codes into the ICD master file, you'll have an additional step here on your diagnosis code library. There's going to be a new right-click option on the diagnosis library. Now, I don't have it on my version of 5.8. This was a recent decision by development, so this is still something under works. It will be in the GR version of the application, but you can expect and anticipate right-clicking the diagnosis code library will give you a new option that looks like this. Add codes from ICD master file. Client will click on that option, and ultimately it's through that option that they're going to be able to import codes from the master file into their diagnosis library. For example, they'll be able to select ICD-10 in this first field here. They select ranges of codes or leave it blank for all codes. That's why, part of the decision was, do we want to leave it up to the clients? Maybe they only want a range of 30,000 codes instead of all 80,000. So they can do it by type and by range, ultimately importing into their library. We do have a major disclaimer on these two screenshots right here. This is a work in progress by development. So ultimately, come GR version of 5.8, the actual verbiage to the right-click menu option might end up being slightly different, and what we see on this screenshot might end up being slightly different. These are just taken right out of a development spec. Since it's being worked on now, not available to us now, these are just what we're envisioning it's going to look like. But it might ultimately, in the end, when it's a done deal, look slightly different. So we just have a disclaimer on the screenshots. Any questions? So, upgrade to 5.8, step 1. Import all ICD-10 codes into your master file. That's step 2. Use new right-click menu option on the diagnosis code library to import ranges of ICD-10 codes from the master file into your diagnosis library. This is step 3. It's asking what is ICD type. That'll make more sense when we get a little bit further in, and in fact, I think to the very next page. So Carla, hold on one second. Essentially, it's either ICD-9 or ICD-10. Carla asked about this field, ICD type, and the drop-down will have 2 choices, ICD-9 or ICD-10. There questions? Someone asked, do I know the specific person doing the development of the right-click stuff? Jan, don't know the specific developer or developers working on this. Sorry. Stacy just mentioned that I just cut out for about 10 seconds, so I'm coming back to the participant panel. Everybody agrees with what Stacy said. Did that happen to everybody where my voice cut out for about 10 seconds on you? I guess trying to determine if it's a WebEx, it happened, iPhone issue, or if maybe a Stacy's phone issue. I'm seeing a lot of X's, Stacy, that no, my voice did not cut out for 10 seconds for most people, so I'm starting to think it might be something with your phone. Continuing on with diagnosis code library. After they've imported ICD-10 codes into their library, how they look and what they're all about here in the library. Now, opening the diagnosis code library here in 5.8, it's obviously very different than what we've been used to in versions 5.7 and prior. There's lots of changes in here. What I'm going to focus on is what's new, and then I'll spend more time on specifics within here. But looking up at the top of the window, this field right here is new, and this goes back to Carla's question a second ago. What's code type? This is a search method. First came in here, a bunch of codes started displaying here in this view panel, so to speak, on the left. Well, this list really is a listing of 9 codes and 10 codes. It's a combination. You know, most of our listing windows only show you so many unless you type in something you're specifically looking for. But so if I want to search in this library for a specific ICD-9 code, I can change this to ICD-9. It'll change down here, and then I can type in part of the specific ICD-9 code I'm looking for to get closer to that range of codes. With a new column down here called type. Again, this column will have either a 9 in it or a 10 in it. Are these ICD-9 codes I'm looking at, or are they ICD-10? In contrast, up top, if I want to search for an ICD-10 code in the library, toggle the setting and start typing in part of an ICD-10 code to get to that range of ICD-10 codes. So the search method up here, by default, when you first come in, it assumes you want to look for any type of code, but you can use this to narrow down the type of code you're trying to find here in the library. It's on the search method using code type, the new field. To pivot, we have a new field. Categories. With table and file maintenance called diagnosis categories, and yes, this is related to that other table called diagnosis categories, but don't get confused and think somehow we're linking a diagnosis category to this library. That's not the intent of it. Diagnosis categories, and we will get to them as I continue on because they've become very important for EPM purposes in 5.8. So we talk about categories. But basically think of a diagnosis category as being a grouping of codes, a grouping of diagnosis codes. They're in another table somewhere else in file maintenance. If I happen to know one of those categories in that other table in file maintenance has a code in it that I'm wanting to look up, you can narrow down your search by using categories. So, for example, if I select the category called diabetes, I'm narrowing down my just the codes, just the ICD-10 codes in that category. If I flip this to 9, using same category, now I'm looking at all the ICD-9 codes in that same category. If I flip this to all, now I'm getting a listing of 9s and 10s that are within that category. So again, I'm not linking the category to this library for some purpose. I'm selecting a category because I'm trying to find a code in this library that I know happens to be in that category. If that makes sense. It's a search method. Category is a search method. To code type as a search and category as a search. These checkboxes are new in version 5.8. In my search, as I do a search to list codes here on the left, I can exclude expired codes from displaying. I can exclude hidden codes from displaying. So nice new little checkboxes that we've never had before. Those are the new items up top. Code and description. This is not new. We've always had this. I can either try to find a code by code, type in part of the code you're looking for. We've always had the ability to find a code by description. Type in the description you're looking for, and that word I'm typing in, do I want to search for anywhere in the description of codes? This is not new. ID code, diagnosis code right here, these are not new. Currently in version 5.7 and prior, every code has an ICD code in the library and corresponding diagnosis code in the library. They happen to be the same, but again, these two fields are not new. I don't want to spend any more time on those. The description field is not new. The user description field is not new. So really, all that's new so far is type, categories, both our search purposes, checkboxes, and that's it up top that's new. Those are items. Now I'm going to also go out, come back in, just because I'm all over the place and I kind of mess up my screen as I'm playing around and talking. All right, continuing on with what else is new. 3 tabs. These are obviously new in our diagnosis code library, kind of like in our service item library. We have a general tab and a payer tab and some other tabs in the SIM library. Well, we now have tabs in our diagnosis code library. I'll back to these tabs. They're for a very specific purpose, particularly these two, the general and the payer tab. I will back to tabs. Below tabs, we have diagnosis subgroups. Familiar with setup and reporting in EPM, we are familiar with what subgroups are. We have many different types of subgroups in EPM. We have location subgroup functionality, we have provider subgroup functionality, we have payer subgroup functionality, we have reason code subgroup functionality. Now in 5.8, we have diagnosis code subgroup functionality. And the end result of all those different kinds of subgroups in our application is for reports. Subgrouping in diagnosis codes is a way to put multiple diagnosis codes into a particular subgroup, and then in EPM we can request or filter a report by that subgroup. It's a lot easier to ask for one subgroup on a report that will pull 50 diagnosis codes for me, as to selecting 50 individual diagnosis codes for my report. So, a reporting tool. I'm going to get a little out of order in our training document. I would like to knock this out, diagnosis subgroups from beginning to end, all the step involved and whatnot on it, and I'll come back to the tabs. Our training document is in just a slightly different order. It cuts the tabs first and then the subgroups. I'm just going to go ahead and subgroups first, and for anyone trying to follow along in the training document, subgroupings on page 14. All right, for any kind of subgrouping in EPM, we start out in enterprise preferences. Sorry, I do see a couple of comments over on the right-hand side chat board, so give me a second. I want to make sure I'm not missing questions. Get it to work. Never mind. It's probably a bug. Jan, I'm not sure. Maybe toward the end of the session, let's see what might be going on for you on that one. In enterprise preferences. We know an enterprise might include one practice. It might include 55 practices. When you make a setting in enterprise preferences, you're potentially affecting multiple practices. These two fields right here that I'm playing with my mouse are new fields in enterprise preferences as being related to diagnosis subgroupings. This is where we come to caption provider subgroups, reason code subgroups, location subgroups, all those other subgroups. Well, diagnosis subgroups are no different. We can come here and give two fields captions. And we're essentially doing, if we type in verbiage in one or both of those fields, we are simply renaming those two fields we were just looking at in the diagnosis code library. I want this field to have a different name, and this field to have a different name. Then name those two fields in your enterprise preferences. It's obviously not required. I haven't done it in my database. I'm just not feeling the need in my database to caption them, but that's how you would do it. Next step in the setup for subgroupings takes us to master lists in maintenance. We have diagnosis code subgrouping master list table. None's preloaded in this table, so if a client wants options, they need to come to master lists and create them, and here's a couple examples I've created. I've got diabetes codes, I've got some fracture codes, I've got some hypertension codes. I can right-click new and build 5 of these or 300 of these subgroupings. It's up to the client. It's pretty easy to build a subgrouping. They're nothing more than a description. And not you'd like to utilize it in EPM, EHR, or both. Well, I'll mainly focus today on the EPM side of things. So we have subgroupings in the master list table. We can go back to our diagnosis code library. As a couple of examples, let me pull up an ICD-10 code that's a diabetes code, like E and 311. Filler code put into a subgrouping of diabetes. Same with this code and 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 50 other codes. I might put them into a subgroup called diabetes. I can now filter reports in EPM by this subgroup. All these diagnosis codes on my report. Another example, maybe a fracture, some sort of fracture code, S72.033. Just a different type of ICD-10 code in a different subgrouping. And again, I might not only have this code, but I might have this one and this one and this one and this one, and 200 other codes in that same subgrouping, allowing me to ultimately pull reports by the subgrouping. Questions on this? It should ring a bell with everybody, I hope. It's really no different than creating a location subgrouping list in master lists, then going to your locations table and linking your locations to different subgroupings. It's the same concept, end result, reports. Questions on the subgroupings or on the 4 new fields we've learned so far in the diagnosis code library? Okay. Let's now go back to the tabs, the general tab, the payer tab, and the other tab. We'll start on the general tab. The tab is used to map code as an ICD-10 code, alternate codes for billing purposes in EPM. Let me go to the training document for a second, specifically page 9, very next page. Okay, it says the general tab allows ICD-10 codes to be mapped to one or more alternate codes for billing purposes, and this is the reason we have or need this functionality. Our clients will need this functionality potentially. Come October 1st of next year, not necessarily every payer is going to be required to accept ICD-10 codes. Yes, the majority of payers like your Aetnas, Cignas, United Healthcares, Medicares, Blue Cross, they're going to be flipping over to ICD-10 by next year, just like the clients are going to have to. But there might be some HIPAA non-covered entities, such as work comp payers, that may be requiring and allowed to use ICD-9 codes. Well, think of it this way now. Let's say we have a client that works with the Aetnas, Cignas, United Healthcares, and they also work with work comp payers. Do we want an end user to have to do that much thinking during charge posting? How much I'm posting on an encounter where the patient has Blue Cross, I better key in ICD-10 codes. And this very next encounter on this other patient over here, it's work comp, it's a work comp payer, I better key in ICD-9 codes. What's for the end user? So what we're going to do come October of next year, end users will be using the current code set. And at that point in time, it's ICD-10. So end user, you're going to use ICD-10 codes on every single patient encounter. If one of them happens to be a work comp payer encounter, you're still going to key in ICD-10 codes and have our diagnosis library translate those codes for that work comp payer to ICD-9 codes on the claim. That's what this general tab is all about. Now, I want to review these 4 examples here because this is important for everybody to know. And this next gen suggests mapping 10 to 9, not mapping 9 to 10 in the diagnosis code library. I mentioned earlier, the ICD-9 codes are much more generic and general, not nearly as specific as the ICD-10 codes. So of that, this one ICD-9 code sitting here, V54.13, it's pretty generic. Here's its counterparts in ICD-10, and I would have to go clear to another page continuing to list comma code, comma code, comma code, are literally, I can count them, but I found in that comparison utility for this one code, there's probably 50 or 60 corresponding ICD-10 codes. It's easier in a mapping to map this code to this, and this code to this, and this code to this, as up to mapping this code to 60 or 70 or 110 codes. That's just an example. Bottom line is, for the mappings, and the user should be always utilizing 10 codes next year, we're going to map 10s to 9s. Approximately 95% of 10 codes to a single 9 code. So here's an example. This is a fracture ICD-10. Here's corresponding counterpart. Approximately 3% of ICD-10 codes are what we call a combination mapping. Mean one ICD-10 might map to 2 or 3 or so ICD-9 codes. Another day for billing purposes, a client might be having to use 2 codes, charge posting. When we get to 10, we're only going to have to use 1 code and wait to these 2, essentially. Okay, so 3% of the codes. That's a pretty small percentage of that 80,000 codes we're talking about. Approximately 2% of ICD-10 codes can't be mapped to an ICD-9 code at all, meaning those ICD-10 codes are brand new. There is currently nothing that even relates to them in the ICD-9 code set. The vast majority of ICD-10s are one-to-one mapping. Clients, we're going to suggest you map 10, the code users should be using, to 9, those payers that still need a 9 code on claims. Let's look in file maintenance at how a mapping is done. Actually, let me think. I'll show you a couple examples, and then I have more to say on that. I have more to say on everything, don't I? S72033A. going on? Why am I not finding my code today? Maybe I was S72.030. Here we go. Okay, here's ICD-10 codes. They're fracture related. I'm just using this one as my example. And S72.033A has something to do with a clavicle fracture, or cervical fracture, excuse me. This is the code the end users will use during charge posting. If and to key in this code on a charge that's going to be billed to someone like a work comp payer that still needs ICD-9 codes, here's our mapping on the General tab. Between this date and this date, we want it to go out on the claim for payers that are set up to use these mappings at 820.02 ICD-9 code. The reason we have so many lines here is just like the reason we have so many lines in our service item library. That may change over time. Today, payers might want this code printed as this on a claim. Next year, who knows? They might want this code presented as something else on a claim. So we have a second line for, to do a new effective date, new expiration date, new code if need be. Each row, as you can see, can handle up to 3 codes for one ICD-10 code. And that goes back to this. 3% of codes where that one code might need to be 2 codes on a claim. That's why we have up to 3 spots here in our mapping. So one code can be mapped up to equal up to 3 different codes on a claim. All right, this is an example of a 1-to-1 mapping. One ICD-10 code to one ICD-9. Let's look at a different code, that E11311, a dietic type code. This is one of those 3% codes where a single 10 code actually will end up being 2 ICD-9 codes on a claim for a payer that needs these mappings. Okay, an illustration of why you might use or how you might use more than one bucket or more than one code here in a mapping. Now back to the training document for a moment. Mappings we're talking about are also referred to or known as GEMs. That's a new term. We all know there's lots of terms used in the industry out there. You're going to start hearing more and more an acronym, GEMs. General Equivalency Mappings. These are actually developed by CMS and the CDC, and it's their way of relating the new ICD-10 codes to the currently used ICD-9. When you think about it, based on what I've shown you in file maintenance, what a client uses, let's say 15,000 ICD-10 codes come October of next year. But they, so in that practice, work with work comp payers that still want ICD-9. Well, now we're talking client, you've got 15,000 of these to these for those work comp payers. That's a lot of work to ask of a client to do all of these mappings by hand. The few mappings I have in my database that I'm showing you today, I did by hand, but we can't expect clients to do these mappings by hand. It's a huge, huge undertaking. So, again, something that's in the works and will be available for clients is a GEM update utility. It's going to end up being another right-click new option on the diagnosis code library. So just eventually there's going to be a right-click import from the ICD master option. There's going to be a new right-click GEMS update menu option. And when you click on that new menu option, a window similar to this, again, it does have our disclaimer. This is a screenshot from a development spec. It may not look exactly like this in the end, but when they do a right-click GEM update on Diagnosis Code Library, they'll be able to go out and browse and load a GEM mapping file from CMS. Think of it maybe as being an Excel spreadsheet with all the mappings in it. They'll be able from that file to select ranges of codes here, the search button to find those codes at the bottom, So, for example, this first column might be the ICD-10 codes, and what ICD-9s are they mapped to? Up to 3 ICDs, 3 9s per 10. I'm going to try to quit saying ICD. It's just too much on my tongue. So the column might be the 10s with corresponding 9 mappings. Well, you can see there's check boxes over here. So now the client can select, pick and choose which mappings to import. And when you hit the import button, it's going to do exactly what you asked it to do. It's going to import the mappings you've selected at the bottom of the window. Again, this is a screenshot of how development envisions this is all going to look. It might look and work slightly different in the end when it's all finalized and part of the application. So no, clients will not have to manually enter all their mappings. I have a utility that will assist them in importing mappings. Questions so far? And let me take a look at the chat board. I don't see anything new on the chat board. And again, please feel free to unmute your phone and ask a question if need be. If I hear or see questions, I keep going. Okay, diagnosis code library. Let's look at that code that I had showed you the mapping on a second ago, that S72.033A. That's a 10 code to a 9. We're moving on to the payer tab. This, just like in the SIM library, where we can now make payer-specific mappings. Just because CMS came up with a set of mappings doesn't mean a specific payer might not have their own. I mean, no laws and rules and regulations that are going to prevent a particular payer from dictating their own mappings on claims. That's what this tab is for. The tab will cover the mapping for most payers. The specific tab will cover mapping for specific payers. So if there's a specific work comp payer that doesn't want an 820.02 when the end user keys in this 10 code, that payer wants an 820.00. Let's go do it on the payer tab for that payer. So in the payer, a different code for that payer. Functionality should not be foreign or new to anybody. Like I said, we have the same concept in our SIM library. If you need to do something payer specific with the code, go to the payer tab. And that's exactly what this is here in the diagnosis code library. If you need to do a mapping specific for a payer, go to the payer tab. Now I did see something come in. Give me a pause while I look at the chat board. Very good question, Kim, and yes, your assumption is correct, but let me share it with everybody. She asks, is it safe to assume the diagnosis 1, 2, 3 here on the left have to exist in our ICD master file in the first place? Absolutely. This has to exist in our master file. These to exist in our master file. You can't, in other words, just free text in a code here. It does have to be a valid code from the master file. Is that what you're asking, Kim? I'm assuming a quiz or no to make sure I understood your question correctly. We text anything, they have to be valid codes in our mappings. Okay, I messed something up on my screen there. Let's go back. So again, S72.033A, for most payers that need mappings, they're going to get an 820.02 on claims, but we have a specific payer that needs something different. That payer is going to get an 820.00 on claims. Question either the general tab or the payer tab, and that the clients will have a utility to help them import mappings for either tab. Do mind, most payers will not need any mappings. August 1st next year is a implementation date, not only for clients, but for payers. I'm in Aetna, Cigna, United Healthcare, Medicare, Blue Cross, you know, but the vast majority of payers need to switch to ICD-10 just like our clients do. It's just those exception type payers like work comp that still may need old codes on claims. So through these two tabs, we can get old codes, old 9 codes on claims for those payers if need be. Okay, the new diagnosis code library. We've got everything new. Code type, categories, excluding our searches. Talked about, I'm sorry, I missed a whole tab here, but there's really nothing new on it. The last but not least tab, the other tab. Everything on the other tab are fields that existed in 5.7 and prior. The recall days, recall letter code, alternate code 1, alternate code 2, and the free text notes. These are not new. They've been every version of NextGen for many, many years. It's just that they move those fields to a separate tab now in version 5.8 for space purposes. The only on this tab that is new is this checkbox, and you'll learn about this checkbox in a session number 2. Pregnancy indicator, it's a way to get an indicator on electronic claims for pregnancy type diagnosis codes. So again, this is the only thing that's new. Everything else you see on this tab has just been moved to tab in version 5.8. Okay, diagnosis subgroup. Oh, nope, we did diagnosis subgroupings already because I jumped a little bit ahead. All right, table next. Cigna, United Healthcare, Medicare, Blue Cross, the simple basic examples I keep repeating over and over and over. The majority of payers will not need those mappings we were just talking about. The user keys in an ICD-10 code on an Aetna patient, we're going to send an ICD-10 code to Aetna on the claim. That will be the case for the majority of payers. So here, payer table, on the default 2 tab, lower left-hand corner, there is a new option to send diagnosis mappings on claims for this payer. The majority of payers, we're not going to mark the checkbox. Majority of payers will get ICD-10 codes on claims. For those special payers, and I keep using work comp as an example, maybe we need to use those mappings so that 10 code ends up being a 9 code on claims for this payer, then yes, we do need to say for this payer, we need to send diagnosis mappings on claims. And once you select the checkbox, we have 3 choices here for the payer. Which mappings? Do we use the general tab mappings, the payer tab mappings, or payer tab mappings if available, otherwise the general tab mappings? So this is pointing back to our diagnosis code library. We had mappings on 2 tabs. We had mappings on a general tab. We had mappings on a payer tab. Which of those tabs, which mappings, which tab do you want to use for this payer on claims? It's pretty simple about. This particular payer is my example that's using general tab mappings. I have another work comp payer, their own mappings. So yes, we do need to send mappings for this payer as well, but for this payer, we're going to use the mappings on the payer tab if available, and if not on that tab, then use the ones on the general tab. And so it's a pretty simple setting. Again, should not be needed for the majority of payers, but is here for those payers that still need ICD-9 codes on claims. Questions? Okay, next, we're moving on to diagnosis categories. EHR system master files over on the left, and yes, I did say EHR here in this EPM session. EHR has always had adult diagnosis categories. Essentially, diagnosis categories, I mentioned earlier, are groupings of diagnosis codes, but these aren't for reporting purposes necessarily. These have always been more for provider use purposes in EHR. So I've got a category open here called diabetes, and it's got a short description. session. From the yellow folder on the left-hand side, you've got access to all diagnosis codes. Find codes, a code you want on the left, and use the blue arrow to move it over to the right. Whatever ends up on the right ends up being in this category. We then would link these categories to providers in the provider table. So let's say Dr. Abbott in our practice works a lot with diabetic patients. He is frequently using diabetic codes. We can link this category to Dr. Abbott. So when Dr. Abbott is in EHR, for example, in the problems module in EHR, he can click on this category and have access to all of his commonly used diabetes codes. That's how diagnosis categories have been used in EHR for years and years and years. This is not a new table. What's new about diagnosis categories is they're now also used in EPM for charge entry diagnosis code searches. So if I go over to the left under EPM system master files, where never before did we ever see diagnosis categories listed as an EPM table because EPM never used them before. In version 5.8, they are now also an EPM table because I'm for searching during charge posting. Clients will have to think about between next October any category that they might want their users to be able to have access to during a diagnosis code search in EPM. They're going to have to do this. Open up and say show in EPM. These two boxes on diagnosis categories are new. There was no need for them previously. It was always an EHR only table. Now in version 5.8, used in both applications, so we've got the show checkboxes that we're familiar with in other tables and file maintenance. When a client upgrades to version 5.8, every one of their existing diagnosis categories is going to look like this after the upgrade. They'll automatically be flagged as show in EHR because that's where they've always been used. At the upgrade, if a category should ultimately be available to users in EPM, we need to make sure it shows in EPM as well by turning on that additional checkbox. The thing while I'm here that clients need to think about between now and next October, the current diagnosis categories are full of ICD-9 codes today. So everybody's using ICD-9 codes in EHR. Well, as next October gets closer and closer and closer, they're going to have to start thinking about adding 10 codes to those categories the providers are using, and possibly maybe even on October 1st, removing 9 codes out of here completely. There's going to be that kind of transition, and again, this is all part of the planning over the next year, 14 months that clients have to start thinking about. They have their providers using a lot of these categories full of 9 codes today. Well, how are we going to phase in the 10 codes into those categories as October 1st gets closer next year? So what I've done in this particular category, I've just added some 10 codes as examples to my existing category that initially included only 9 codes. They can also, if they think it might be easier, create completely new categories that they'll implement next October 1st. Oh, I wish there was a clear button here. Let me go back out and back in. As an example, I created a new category, primarily for EPM purposes. I call fee ticket ICD-10 codes. Maybe they're going to be the ICD-10 codes on fee tickets come October of next year. So I created one by this name. I used a folder. I did search to find all the 10 codes that are going to end up on fee tickets eventually and included nothing but 10 codes in this particular category. Speaking of which, fee tickets. Clients have to think about that as well. Today, their fee tickets, if they're still using one, are of 9 codes. October of next year, we're going to have a lot of clients, maybe needing help between now and then in doing their fee tickets to replace the 9 codes with 10 codes. So that's a side note, something else clients need to start thinking about. All right, new category full of nothing but 10 codes. My diabetes category that already existed, I've added 10 codes to it. One thing that's new with these categories in 5.8, if you click, they now practice access functionality that they've never had before. So as they create categories, if the client is a multi-practice client, they can right-click on any of these categories and decide, which practices should or should not have access to this particular category. It's new in 5.8. On categories so far. Concept I had mentioned earlier, the categories are ultimately linked to the providers. That hasn't changed. That's the same in version 5.8. So I go to my providers table next and look at maybe Dr. Adams here. The categories tab in the providers table, there's 3 different types of categories that are used in EHR: service categories, diagnosis categories, modifier categories. We're talking diagnosis categories right now. So in this example for Dr. Adams, on the left-hand side is a listing of all diagnosis categories from that table. The ones that Dr. Adams uses most often are linked to him over on the right. The ones when Dr. Adams is in HR he has access to, now in EPM, and this is critical to understand, took me a while to figure this one out. EPM, if I'm posting charges on a Dr. Adams encounter, I have access to these categories as well. If I'm posting charges on a Dr. Anderson encounter in EPM, I have access to these categories. In words, in EPM, and this will be confusing unless we can clearly explain it to clients and end users, categories in EPM charge posting are going to be different potentially on every encounter. It's based on the encounter rendering. Just to understand. Questions on that? And I'll demo it to you in a little bit here. Okay, but the concept of linking the categories to a provider here in the providers table, nothing new. What's new is we're now also going to be using those categories in EPM for those providers. Okay, that takes me to EPM next. In EPM, and we're up to page 20 here. We're user preferences, charge posting, the patient's chart, and reports, starting with general user preferences. And preferences, user general. General tab in preferences at the very bottom, they've added a new option, default charge entry diagnosis to what diagnosis category. So I think this one should be pretty easy to understand if a user chooses to do this. If I turn this on in my user preferences and I select a diagnosis category from file maintenance, this is going to be my default. Remember, these are groupings of diagnosis codes in file maintenance, and I had created that one for fee tickets full of ICD-10 codes. By setting my preferences up this way, this is going to be my default diagnosis category during charge posting. So an individual user can do this themselves, or as we know in file maintenance under EPM, general user preferences, we can set this up in file maintenance and then push this out to multiple users in system admin. So that functionality is there as well. Bottom line is a user can have a default diagnosis category. Questions on that? Okay, going to go look at the charge posting screen and learn a new diagnosis search screen we have available in EPM. So I just need to go to a chart on what's my encounter number. Okay, I have an encounter on a patient, and for purposes of demo, I've linked 3 insurances to this patient's encounter. Primary payer does not use any of those ICD-10 to ICD-9 mappings. In other words, primary payer, the user keys in a 10 code, the user's going to get 10 codes on claims. Their secondary insurance happens to be one that uses or still needs ICD-9 codes. This payer is set up in file maintenance to use the general tab mappings for diagnosis code library. And the third payer is set up to use the payer tab mappings from the diagnosis codes library on claims. So I wanted, to show you an example of all 3 types of payers. Again, can't say it enough. Most payers will not use mappings. Let's put charges on this encounter, at least one charge. Okay, users cooking along there, starting with their office visit E&M code. By the way, if these 2 fields, price fields down here, just caught anyone's eye as looking new and different, they're related to advanced SIM library mode. This is another new enhancement in version 5.8. Come to a session 2 to learn about that one. Sticking with diagnosis codes right now. I can't get sidetracked. Right, we still have our standard functionality when it comes to diagnosis code entry on the charge screen. If the user knows the code, type in the code. If the user doesn't know the code, go to the other side and start being in part of the description of the code. Same functionality we've always had in EPM, hasn't changed a bit. And up until now, those have always been our only 2 choices in EPM, either code or description. Well, you'll notice in 5.8, flashlight search icon between the 2 fields that initiates a new diagnosis search window. I want to spend a few minutes on the search window. The very first time a user comes in here, the categories they see on the left are to be dependent on, as I tried to explain earlier, the rendering provider on the encounter. So in a Dr. Baker encounter, the windows allows me to use the categories that are linked to Dr. Baker in file maintenance. I hope that makes sense. I'm closing coming in. There is a method to my madness. But again, the very first time a user clicks that flashlight and comes into this window, they will see some categories listed on the left if the encounter rendering has categories linked to them in file maintenance. The thing over here on the right, this time in, there will be 1 column displayed here. I should have done this before class, so give me just a second. And they get this 1 category sitting here called Clinical Description and ICD Code. If I click on one of Dr. Baker's categories, I see a description for all those codes in that category, and on the end of the description, I see the code. That's the column name, description, and code. You get the description first with the code at the end. Well, from an EPM perspective, I personally don't like that. I'd rather see the code first, followed by any kind of descriptions. So what I want to show you here is how to customize this column view. Again, it's similar functionality to other places in our application. If you right-click on the column heading, there's a couple ways I can do it. I can either turn on additional columns, clicking on them one at a time. So I've ended up now with an ICD, a billing description, a clinical description, and over on the right is the original column that was by itself when we first came in. Maybe I don't like this column or don't need this column. I can get rid of that column by right-click, turn it off. You can also pick up a column on the heading and drag it to reorder them. You also right-click and go to this option called Set Columns to Display to open up a window that looks like this. Again, the first time in, only one column is set to display in your view. Well, it's kind of like, again, similar functionality to what we're used to. Well, I want to add that column to my view, and I want to add this one, and I want to add this one, and I want to take that original one off by use of buttons. I just did the same thing I did a second ago with right-click on the column headings and add them one at a time. In the window, you can also move up, move down by use of these buttons. So maybe I want this description before the clinical description. Okay, or right-click, turn them on, off. After you have the ones you want, drag and drop them into the order you want. Or put all within one window called Set Column Display. Add, remove, move up and down, and hit OK. That's all the time I want to spend on that. It should be pretty basic functionality for most of us. You can also do it from this little cog icon or icon in the lower left-hand corner. It's the same as right-clicking on the column headings. Now let's learn how to search and the various types of searches we can do here. Search. I know part of the description or part of a word in the description that I'm looking for. Type in part of a word, hit search button, and you will get a listing of, now because there are so many diabetes codes, it takes a second there. You'll get a listing of all codes that have a word anywhere in the description that starts with those letters. If you happen to know the code, type in part of the code you're looking for and hit search to get a listing of codes that start with those characters. So again, functionality so far. There's no clear button, and it's something, I've brought it up to development. They think it's probably a good idea. It's not here. We have to just learn to live with it. I think it would be nice to have a clear button so I can kind of clear my search criteria up here and start all over. But that's not going to change. There will be no clear button come DAR, so it's just something we have to learn to live with. I just want to show you some other things. Favorite folders. By the way, I'm sorry. You can highlight to see what's in a category. You can highlight to see what's in one of your favorite folders. I'll show you how to create those in a moment. You can highlight the words all diagnosis codes to do search of the entire diagnosis code library, either by part of a word in the description or by part of the code and then hitting the search button. Favorite folders. A user can add new favorite folders from this plus sign. I hit the plus sign, it defaults to a name of favorite too. Well, I'm going to call this Ray's Faves. You can name a folder whatever the heck you want, and this is for me only. I'm logged in. I'm creating folders for me. In case anybody is about to ask, or if you're wondering, no, you cannot create a favorite folder for one user and then move it to somebody else. Each user, if they want favorite folders, would create their own. So I have this new favorite folder without a single code in it. To put codes in it, I'm going to go search all diagnosis codes. Codes that I use all the time or frequently. Then I'm going to grab one with my mouse and drag and drop it over to my folder. Drag and drop to plop them into your favorites folder. It's as simple as that. It's a little, and well, I'll get to it in a second. It's confusing to me, and I want to be sure I show everybody else. Now, in my Ray's Faves folder, I've got those two codes. My initial folder up here that I never did rename and that I can rename by double-clicking into the folder name. In the original folder, I have maybe 9 or 10 codes that I had previously added. User can create as many favorite folders as they want. If they've created a folder that they no longer want, they can delete that folder. Highlight it. Each folder highlight brings up an X, a red X. Just hit the X to delete the entire folder. I want to delete a code out of a folder, go to the folder, right-click on the code, and delete it from the group. Or add a code to one of your other favorite folders, kind of like moving it. And that's about all the time I have for favorite folders. They're user-specific. We've all talked that these categories are from file maintenance. The categories listed are those that are linked to rendering provider on this particular encounter. So those categories will potentially be different for every encounter based on provider. All right, a few little tricks that I discovered over time that I want to share with everybody. When you're in this search mode, if you have typed in, you start out on all diagnosis here, which means I need to search the entire library. You type in part of a code and go find it. Find the codes that start with S72. I'm sorry, I should have typed in a couple more characters to make the search a little bit quicker. But let it finish. Oh my gosh. I don't know if that's the way I searched or if suddenly my system's slow for some reason, but I do want to try to think it through. I think there probably are a bazillion codes that start with S72. That was stupid on my part. Oh, here we are. All right, here's a bunch of codes that start with S72. We'll go straight from there to one of providers' categories, chest pain. Oh my, there's nothing in this category for this provider. What happened? There was a few seconds ago. Oh my gosh, something's wrong. Call support. You know, the codes are gone. What's going on? What's going on? This was my confusion, and it will be others' confusion as well. The steps I just went through, searching for a particular code that starts with these characters in the entire diagnosis library, and then from there I just randomly went to one of the provider's categories. It thinks I'm wanting to see codes in this category that start with these characters that I left up here. If I get rid of these, or if I go back to all diagnosis codes and then back to that chest pain, here's the original codes. It told me anything a second ago because there isn't a single code in here that started with S72. So you've left a remnant of a previous search, so to speak, up here in the top field, and then you click on a category down here. It thinks you're searching for that in this category, and it may or may not find something. I hope that makes sense. It was confusing to me. It's like, what am I doing wrong? It took me a while to figure this out. It's like I'm up here and I type something in, I hit search and I find a bunch, but then I come down here to trying to go to a category and it displays nothing, and I know I have codes in my category. Because I left some description or some code up here that didn't exist in that category. I wanted to share that with everybody. It's a new window we've never had before. It's got nice functionality, I think. It's a great window. It certainly beats the heck out of only being able to search by code or description. You know, be real. It could save a lot of time, actually, if I know that keying is on Dr. Baker, who works a lot with diabetic patients, and I have his diabetic category here. This will be real quick to those codes in that category. And by the way, I just selected by double-clicking on a code. Find the code somehow, some way, double to select it. Now I'm going to cancel because I don't want to use those ICD-9 codes. I want to show you an example using ICD-10. Okay, in my example, I'm going to use a total of 3 ICD-10 codes. The first one's related to a fracture because these are the codes and users should be using come October 1st of next year, and it would help if I'm in the right field. Fracture code. We've got a diabetes issue going on with the client, with the patient. Oops. E11311. I do that every time. The third one is a hypertension code. And one of the codes I used is 7 digits. One of the characters, I should say. One of the codes is 6. One of the codes is 3. That's why we have 80,000 of them. They're of varying lengths. Three of those are ICD-10 codes. I'm going to go ahead and save this charge. The thing I failed to point out that I just thought of, so let's pretend I'm doing a new charge, maybe an 81002, a urinalysis. They're checking the urine for sugar because of the diabetes problem. We still have this functionality where if the fracture code has nothing to do with what we're doing the urinalysis, delete it out, it bumps the other two up. We're doing the urinalysis to check for sugar. It has nothing to do with the hypertension, so I'm getting rid of that one too. So that functionality hasn't changed at all. So now I have two charges with ICD-10 codes on them. I want to go back to the training document for a moment to show you page 29. Scenario that I'm trying to show you real time in EPM. On my payers, the primary payer is not going to be using any mappings. So on claims for the primary payer, we should see the ICD-10 codes I just keyed in. For the secondary payer, if you recall, in file maintenance, my secondary payer was set up to use general mappings. So the first code I typed in for fracture, this is the code. It's mapped this code on the general tab in the diagnosis code library. My tertiary payer on the encounter is set up to use payer tab mappings in the diagnosis code library, and I have a slightly different code for that particular payer on that tab. The second diagnosis code I entered, diabetes. Again, for primary payer, this is the code they're going to get on the claim. They get ICD-10. Secondary payer is going to get two codes for one code claim. Tertiary payer has no mappings on the payer tab for E11-311, but if you remember, that payer is set up to use payer tab mappings if available. Others use general tab. And the last code again, primary is going to get the 10, secondary is going to get this, tertiary is going to get this. Just kind of wanted to review the codes I've entered, the mappings going on behind the scenes in my diagnosis code library. Oops. Another comment I want to make. During charge posting, I just hit new to add a new charge. We have buttons over here above diagnosis, 4 buttons. Default, it went to the diagnosis button immediately. That is the only button of these 4 that will actually allow me to type in and use codes or descriptions and get my diagnosis codes in there. You have to be on the diagnosis button. If I go to add a new charge, in the process, for whatever reason, I click over here on this button, I just locked out all of these diagnosis fields. I'm trying to click into the diagnosis code field, can't get into it, trying to come over to description, can't get into it, trying to click my flashlight, and this is doing something for a different purpose that I'll explain later, but that's not our normal search window I just showed you a few minutes ago. The point is, and again, we just need to train clients. During posting, it defaults to that button. Leave that button alone. That's going to allow you to get into codes, options, or the window. Okay. Now to my mappings for what I did back here on the office visit, the 99213. And why is my screen doing stupid stuff on me? Here we go. Other buttons. 1, alternate diagnosis. COB2, COB3, alternate diagnosis. Primary payer on this encounter is not using mappings. So click primary payer, alternate diagnosis codes, freak out or let the client freak out. Oh my gosh, I just lost all my diagnosis codes. No, you didn't. Primary payer on this encounter has no alternate codes to display for you. The primary payer isn't using mappings, therefore it has no alternate codes to show. If you go to the original button, here's your codes. You haven't lost them. Again, it's just that primary is not using mappings, so nothing displays. Secondary is using general tab mappings, so that the 3 ICD-10 codes I started out with are mapped to a total of 4 different ICD-9 codes for secondary and different ICD-9 codes for tertiary. Does that kind of make sense? This is a way to view the mappings by payer if our mappings for a payer, and it's payer dependent. My primary payer is this one. Use mappings. So far on how those buttons work up there, the COB 1, 2, and 3 alternate diagnosis code buttons, and why it's showing what it's showing when I click those various buttons. The question is why this one is blank versus one has 4 codes versus this one has 4 codes versus I entered 3. This E11311 is code library. Code E11311 is 2 codes. It's one of those 3% codes, a single code mapped to 2 codes that's needed on claims. I'm watching for questions. I'm listening for questions. And again, if I don't see or hear questions, I keep going. A similar functionality, these buttons, is added to the chart. Remember, we also have this diagnosis code section here. So on the encounter general side tab, wrong button, by the way, the last button you clicked on the charge screen will automatically be selected here. That's just something else I happen to have noticed over time. So the last button I happened to have clicked on the charge posting screen was COB3. Went off the charge posting screen and came to these encounter level diagnosis codes. It was already sitting on 3. But these buttons work just like they do on the charge posting screen. The diagnosis button shows you the original codes entered. COB1 shows you, oh, yeah, see? I got user that's confused. COB1, the primary, is not using mappings, so the COB1 button isn't going to show me any alternate codes. COB2 is showing me 4 alternate ICD-9s, and COB3 is showing me 4 alternate ICD-9s. This functionality is just the same as it is on the charge posting screen. And if anybody's wondering about procedure in the middle, that additional button, that's not new in 5.8. We've always had it. It's related to procedural diagnosis codes potentially used on UB claims. So I'm skipping over that button because it really is not new in version 5.8. Question on this view from the chart here. Okay, and final last thing I want to show you, I'm going back to the charge screen. If the mappings need to be changed on this encounter only, for the patient this encounter only, we can modify and update the mappings, in my example, for either secondary or tertiary insurance. And there you'd go about it. Highlight the charge that you need to modify mappings on, open charge, go to the alternate diagnosis mappings. In other words, maybe we filed this claim to secondary insurance with these ICD-9 codes, and it kicks back from insurance. They want to see an 820.00. Go to that charge, to that payer, to the flashlight. At this point, it's not our new search window. At this point, it's showing us that mapping, the 8202, is to this original ICD-10 code. But in this window, as you can imagine and you can guess, I could find a different code, left, move it to the right, and takes one off. Altogether, I'm modifying the mapping for this one code on this one encounter for this one patient. Now, if I'm going to do this 50 times a day, because obviously our setup is wrong in file maintenance or something, it's always coming up with the wrong mapping, so I'm having to change it on 50 patients, change it in your diagnosis code library and fix it for this point forward. But if it's a one-time only on this one charge, on this one encounter for this one patient, I need to modify the mappings. Here's how I can do it. And I'm going to go ahead and put it back to what it was. If it's the combination codes, remember, these two in the middle are related to my one diabetic ICD-10 code that I keyed in. Click on either of those, and it will show you both of the codes that were mapped to the original 10. And if needed, I can change the mapping for both codes. Pull in and remove other ICD-9 codes for the mapping on this one charge, on this one patient for this one encounter. Question that. Oh, I'm going to cancel. Let's cancel that, close my charge screen. Let's talk claims for a few minutes. And I just want to make sure I'm on my right patient, and yes, I am. All right. I had created a claim for all three of those payers on an encounter that is set up exactly like the one I just demoed a minute ago. So I try to have these done in advance. I created a claim for the payer that's not using mappings, primary. I did a claim for the payer that is using general tab mappings, secondary. And I created a claim for a tertiary payer that's using the payer tab mappings, based on all my setup and file maintenance. So this would be the first claim to go out to primary. This will need to be using this new 2012 1500 claim form by October of next year. Again, if this is the first time you're seeing or hearing, oh my gosh, what's he talking about? We have a new 1500 form. Yes, we do, in both version 5.7 UD1 and in version 5.8. With 2012 CMS 1500 form, new updated form. You'll learn more about this form again in session number 2. All I have time for in this session is to show you that here are my ICD-10 codes on the claim for the primary, and they're indicated as ICD-10 codes by this 0 right here. We look at claim for secondary that's using general tab mappings from file maintenance. They get 4 ICD-9 codes indicated as such here. And remember, the 1E code, the 10 code for diabetes for secondary, mapped combination code. And tertiary insurance was also using mappings, but mappings on the payer tab. So the ICD-9 codes on their claim might be slightly different. But again, they are ICD-9s. This is combination code for the diabetic ICD-10 code. I think it's this. For secondary was an 820.02, and for tertiary it was mapped to an 820.00, and there was a slight difference in this code as well in the mappings. Anybody that's on this call seeing this claim form for the very first time, while we're here, you can see the new CMS paper claim form can handle up to 12 diagnosis codes per page. And our diagnosis pointers down here are referencing letters. The current form that we're all used to holds 4 diagnosis codes, numbered 1, 2, 3, and 4. They're lettered A through L. Therefore, the pointers will reference A through L. Again, that's all I'm going to say on that. Come to session number 2. We spend more time on this new claim form. The main thing I'm wanting to show you here is the claims will be different based on payer. Payer is using mappings. Question on that. This also works with UB claims. So I think I have an encounter here or two that's a UB payer. This is a new UB claim form in 5.8. This is the same UB form we have currently, but they've made one slight change to it. So this happens to be a payer filed on UB, and let me think, am I on the right one? I want 1101 first. Sorry, I'm getting my encounter numbers confused. Here's a UB claim. ID 10 codes on. Nope, ICD 9. What to today? The only difference and the only modification they made here in version 5.7 UD1 and in 5.8 is this indicator. They've added this indicator function. So again, the 9 indicates these are ICD 9 codes. UB with ICD 10. Indicates that 10, these are two ICD 10 codes. So it works on ADA. I'm just going to go to my community health center practice real quick. That's the practice I have that I have dental billing set up in. Here's. Number 1, which was general mappings. Okay. This is a brand new ADA form, version 5.7 UD1 and in 5.8. It's a 2012 ADA form. You'll learn more about this in a session number 2. I just want to show you, related to our topic at hand today, this new ADA form can diagnosis codes, and in this example, we're looking at ICD-10 codes. I can enter ICD-10 codes because of the AB reference right here. For ICD-9s, you would get a B. For ICD-10s, you get an AB. So AB, these are ICD-10s. Oops, sorry, far. These are ICD-9s. Claims. New 1,500 claim to accommodate ICD-10. New ADA claim to accommodate ICD-10. Existing UB claim slightly modified to include that 9 or 0 indicator on the claim. 9 for ICD-9s and 0 for ICD-10s. Okay, a couple of things. Report-wise, and I'm going to go to the training document here, page 37. Reports, specifically the reports listed on this page. These specific reports in EPM all have new columns on them in version 5.8. There's 4 new columns called Type 1, Type 2, Type 3, Type 4. And on this page, even more columns in version 5.8, additional filters on these specific reports, and all this is ripping around being able to accommodate 9 versus 10 on reports, being able to show diagnosis categories on reports, and our new diagnosis subgroupings on reports. So to know some of these new columns, I'm going to run a quick memorized report. I go to my right practice. It's a memorized version of the daily charges report, where I build a lot of these new columns into the report for easy demo. These 4 columns right here are new. 1, 2, Type 3, Type 4. So if we look at this middle charge right here, this, what is it, a 99213, these are the diagnosis codes entered on that charge. Diagnosis 1 happens to be an ICD-10. Diagnosis 2 is an ICD-10. And diagnosis 3 is also an ICD-10 code. For those 3 diagnosis codes, the first one is part of my fracture diagnosis subgrouping. The second one is part of my diabetes diagnosis subgrouping. Number 3 is in my hypertension subgrouping. To the right of that, additional new codes, all 3 of those diagnosis codes on that charge are all in my fee ticket ICD 10 code diagnosis category. New columns. New columns and new filters. I just want to, again, show you one more time. Sorry for my scrolling here. On these reports on page 37, we get new columns. These reports on page 38, we have additional new columns and new filters. Okay, it takes me to last but not least, form and label templates. They had to make some modifications to the data repository, the data fields in file maintenance for forms and labels to accommodate ICD-10. So this is just a screenshot of file maintenance. I form templates table. I'm looking at the data repository. Under the charges category of data fields, these specific data fields, charge 1 diagnosis code through charge 6 diagnosis code, have been modified. So if a client is utilizing any of those fields, a form or a label, they will be able to handle and successfully print either an ICD-9 or an ICD-10 code. Under claim information, there are also diagnosis-related data fields. These are not new data fields. I want everybody to understand that. It's just that development had to enhance or modify the existing data fields to accommodate 9 versus 10 codes, and also a few under fee ticket options. Question. Okay, it does look like a couple things came up on the board, so give me just 1 second here. Joanne asks, is there a limit of 3 characters to box E? It says ABC instead of ABCD. I'm assuming you're talking about a claim. I just want to make sure I'm following your question, Joanne, so if I'm going down the wrong road, tell me. I'm going back to my patient's chart that had the example claims I was showing you, and I believe I was showing you on encounter number 1107 an example of the claim with ICD-10 codes on it. CS 1500, is this the root of your question somehow, some way? Is there a limit of 3 characters to box E? Oh, no. There is not. Box down here. I'm sorry. Your E, I'm thinking E here. You're talking 24E. There is no limit to 3 down here. There's a limit to 4. There always has been. And it's limited to 4. Is each charge can only have up to 4. Asks on the secondary. Okay, so let me go to the secondary claim. In general tab mappings. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yes, thank you. The secondary claim ends up having 4 diagnosis codes on it based on the mapping. But what caught Joanne's eye here, and good catch, Joanne, this really should be A, B, C, D. I did bring this to development. This is a defect. They are have it fixed by GR. It should reference all 4 diagnoses. This should reference all diagnosis codes. The box should be saying A, B, C, D right now. Development knows about this one. We'll be fixing it. Good catch, Joanne. Any other questions? Okay, I think I'm going to do at this point is stop sharing my desktop, stop the recording,